Hello and welcome back. I'm here with a very good friend of mine and someone who I have a lot of respect for and really like to chat about politics with, political ideology, political philosophy. A friend of mine who has a degree in political science. Please welcome to the show, Chris Hewitt. I still have the nameplates on there. I'm going to get them off of the thing. Chris Hewitt, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So we were talking. We were like, we've got to do something. We've got to chit chat about stuff because I feel like
we argue with each other, not in front of people, way too much.
Right. I feel like there's all kinds of great content of just like, that's a great thought. Mm-hmm. That's a great. It's everything.
Yeah. People at the bar get to enjoy it all the time, but we want to expand the audience a little bit. People that are actually interested.
Yeah. So I decided, well, what should we talk about? And then you brought it up, actually, because we were talking about various forms of government. I think one of them that had come up was, I think Israel was in the news, and we were like, man, the way Israel does government is very weird. But then it kind of morphed into socialism, communism. Is China really even communist? Is it really even socialist? What is their government system? And how does it compare? And how can we compare and contrast that to other governmental systems, and how does culture play a role in that? When we particularly this revolved a little bit around the last couple of weeks, that South Park episode, right? And how much do private companies have to kowtow to the Chinese government,
right.
And then how much is their government making accommodations for capitalism, and as much as they espouse to not be.
There's a lot of snake eating itself,
right?
Considering one is a communist government and the other is a very capitalist one.
All right, so maybe that's a good place to start. Is China a communist government?
Well, one of the things that is most illuminating to me is what countries tell themselves that they are. Right? You can believe one thing, but they're myths. The people that in America, we tell ourselves that we're the greatest country on earth, oldest democracy, and all this stuff, which of course we can parse out and look at the veracity of, as does everyone else. And China, of course, has a very similar thing. I think quite technically, since Deng Xiaoping in 1979, they kind of abandoned a lot of the Maoist agrarian communism that most defined China, and still does, as far as their their mythos, their idealism is to achieve communism. But since Deng Xiaoping in 79, and you have the Gang of Four trials, they basically publicly disavowed the mistakes of the Cultural Revolution and adopted more of this, what we would call basically a capitalist corporatist system.
Yeah,
so 1979.
79, when Deng Xiaoping comes into power. And I remember reading Mao spoke about Deng Xiaoping as like, and his sort of brand of, operating within the communist system as kind of an affront to the ideals, but a necessary evil.
Well, so like revisionism is what a lot of the slander of the fellow communists would throw at each other when you're like, trying to do the forms and functions of capitalist governments that are really successful at building planes, trains, automobiles, and cupcakes. And you as your
cupcakes,
things that are great, but you don't necessarily need. That you're, by doing the forms and functions of the capitalist states, you're kind of losing the forest for the trees. So they would call them like revisionists. But ironically, Deng Xiaoping was a big Maoist. Mm-hmm. And then he reverses course post-Mao. Chinese politicians can be as hypocritical as American ones.
Well, I think there was some recognition almost of that over that time period of, hey, there are enough people who have enough incentives to engage with some kind of capitalist structure, company structure, foreign companies, right? How do we interface with that? And I think there's a number of things that are going on, right? So there's the human portion of the fact that, hey, capitalism is going on and individuals really can benefit if they engage with that capitalism. And to as much extent as they're allowed to, there's going to be some portion of people that have incentive to do so. But more than that, you live in a world where other nations are propping up this system of economic trade, and no one exists in a vacuum. So we talk about political
Certainly.
systems and ideas and how they're manifestations in a long way of their culture, but they don't exist in a vacuum.
Poor agrarian communist societies that are trying to organize around these really utopian principles, man, you can poison that a lot with Blue Jeans and Beatles records. You know, it's really hard to, in the moment, deny your people comforts and economic safety and security in service to these wider ideals. So yeah.
I would say there's even disagreement on the socialist/communist left about whether you can consider China truly a socialist country or truly a communist country. I think you'll find some people that will say, no, it has these economic zones. It's clearly trying to interface with capitalism on this particular plane. But you'll have others that will say, yeah, they're having to do those things in some way or another, but certainly the goals are there, right? It's certainly a socialist experiment. It has some accommodations, but these are even on the far left.
So I would compare it to like how conservatives in America might say things like, oh, we really love the founding fathers. We really like democracy and all this stuff. But really, when it comes down to it, they'll sacrifice that in an instant if it's convenient.
Yeah, I'm going to adjust your camera real quick. You can keep
sure.
going. You can keep going.
The Confucius conservatives of China's traditional 19th century seem to have weathered the communist storm of Mao and the agrarians post-Chinese Civil War. And so now what you see is like, oh, sure, it's these forms of communism, but really the conservative authoritarian old guard has really just come back, and they kind of ride the wind and sails of this really positive thing where Mao, there's a lot of Maoism that reads really well. I mean, poetic and utopian, the likes of which Stalin could only hope for, but Mao had a really different view, right? It was the peasant, it wasn't the proletariat, it was the peasants. And it wasn't in the cities where the workers are, it's out in the fields where the peasants are. And he saw this really differently as to where the communist revolution would take hold as a global rural versus the urban, whereas way more in line kind of with Engels, who, and they're just arguing about where the revolution will come from.
What sector of the economy?
Right.
So
will the proletariat do it? Is it going to come from here? Is it going to come from there?
The rural working class or the factory working class, I guess, is the...
Right, which is a distinction I'm not really. I'm like, oh, is that a really big deal? Can't they both,
doesn't it matter?
Can't they
Does
both
it
hang
matter?
out together? Like, can't we? We need.
Who cares
we
where
need
it comes
the corn
from, right?
And we need the tractors. So, but he also had Mao had a saying, and I'm butchering all this, of course, because I don't speak Chinese, but he was something like, we need a Chinese version of this. So unlike global international communism that was like our brothers everywhere, solidarity, there's this more like, oh, we're doing a very specific China thing. So what we're doing here is not necessarily something we're subscribing that will work in Moscow, but it'll work everywhere that there's peasants. It'll work everywhere where you have the imperialists are dominating your cities and corrupting your capitalists. It'll work there. So it was a very distinct. Deng Xiaoping called it a cult of personality, but Mao, in his little red book, argued a much more universal thing that I think was much more idealistic and compelling than Stalinism. Right.
Yeah, I mean, and those two ideas, right? The accusation that it's a cult of personality and the claim that it's really an agrarian, egalitarian, for everyone kind of movement, sort of miss each other. I mean, the Little Red Book is plastered with Mao's face all over it. It's hard to say that it isn't.
But it isn't one. Yeah.
Part his personality is not a huge part of it. But I mean, to the same point, what is written in the Little Red Book is very much like it is a Chinese version of
part of
Marx and Engels, right?
Part of what the little, his face and the propaganda and all that stuff is, another saying that they used was, the agrarian, the peasant class is a blank slate. They're not like the proletariat that has generations of politics behind them. They're ignorant peasants. You can start anew. You can start afresh with them. And he was using it as a good thing, not as a negative. But so part of that where we see propaganda of like, oh, you're really forcing this stuff on this group of people. I think then, and again, this is their arguments, not mine necessarily, but was that these are forms and functions that you need to do to start a thing. And so, yeah, I'm going to plaster my name all over everything. Everyone's going to know me, but I'm starting something bigger than myself afterwards.
So do you think Chinese version of communism, who do you think was closer to being right? Was Maoism? Yeah, Mao or Deng Xiaoping?
Oh, well.
Was it a cult of personality, or was there really an effort to make this go beyond
Well, the Cultural
China?
Revolution was, if you ask the Chinese and the Chinese government and Deng Xiaoping, they have officially decided that the Cultural Revolution was a whoops-a-daisy. I mean, they use different term, but but they, acknowledge.
Wait, so
that,
is it the Great Leap Forward, or is it the
Great Leap Forward, was that Russia or was that?
Great Leap Forward's China also. They're different eras, and I get them confused.
Yeah.
But the greater cultural revolution is.
Yeah, maybe it was the Great Leap Forward that they're talking about was the mistake. But it was, so they introduced the judiciary back during this time is where they got the rightists, and they kind of do a lot of purging, the anti-rightists campaign, and they do a lot of purging and a lot of international condemnation. And then afterwards in '89 is when they try the Gang of Four, the Politburo who was involved in all that, as a show to the international community that, look, we're bringing the rule of law back. We're also opening up our markets back. We're, Nixon came, we're open for business. And
when was that, in 76?
This is 79. This is all
79.
around the same time. I think this trial goes on in 84 or something. But,
Okay.
That's all part of the same pack. So who is right? Deng Xiaoping. If you're like, hey, is China the next global superpower and who's responsible for that more, Mao or Deng? I don't know. That's a pretty good question. I would definitely say that if they went along with Maoism in its purest form, you might have something much more like Pyongyang going on, only with, a billion more people. And I don't know that would be as successful for the Chinese. Would that be better for everyone in the world? Would it be better for the people in, say, Hong Kong? Would it, I don't.
Well, if you're comparing it to Pyongyang, it sounds like you'd say it's probably worse for, at the very least, the people of China.
Yeah, if you're asking a modern Chinese person who's my age and whose parents and grandparents were involved in the Chinese Civil War and the occupation of Japan, and is life better now than it was? Then your answer is probably there. But if you ask the people of Tibet, if you ask the Uyghurs, if you ask, there is a cost always to these to the empirical empires taking care of its people, specifically economically. There seem to be losses for those gains. That, they had war with India. They're at a conflict stance with most of their neighbors. It has been a largely peaceful process for them, for the people of Shanghai and Beijing, just like, in America, we have our hands very lightly bloodied. We have a professional mercenary corps that does that for us now. Apparently, and they're for hire, I hear. If you would if you pay a lot of money, you can.
Well, the other thing is the way the United States, first of all, we're a colonialist empire, which China is not. They don't operate in that same capacity. They're not. So the United States, it's kind of comparing apples and oranges in a large way. But in the way that the United States has a bunch of overseas wars to prop up, international hegemony around a commodity.
It's a unique situation.
Right.
It's true. It's not.
Right,
we're
but
very unipolar.
But Western countries in
right?
general operated via a colonialist imperialist model throughout much of the 18th and 19th century. That
Oh yeah, certainly.
right,
Yeah.
and that a lot of the sort of the hangover of that went over into the 20th and now the 21st century. That the only really Asian nation we saw try to emulate that on a mass scale was Japan, to really disastrous effect, and had the entire international community go, "Man, you're doing the colonialism thing like way too wrong, man. Like tone it down with
Yeah.
Nanjing and stuff. Come on."
Man.
But China never really did that. Their form of trying to gain international relevance has been through economic trade. And you bring up some points of
Well, same with the United States.
right. I'll put it this way: China has gone for the economic trade route, sans colonialist, imperialist militarism.
Without barracks, right? Sure.
Right. I mean, things like building highways in Africa and things like that, and facilitating trade in Southeast Asia. Their borders, certainly they've got with the Uyghur Muslims in the West, Tibet in the West and South. Obviously, there's been a lot of hand-wringing over Macau and Hong Kong and exactly how that's going to play out, and certainly as well Taiwan/Chinese Taipei. Thanks, Olympics. But
Do they still do that?
yeah, in the
Olympics
Olympics,
still?
they announced it as Chinese Taipei
Okay.
because China is in the Olympics,
Right.
and they would be mad if they called it Taiwan. Anyway, it's really hard to look at those situations of a state that is attempting to run under a socialist banner, socialist communist banner, and how it relates to ethnic and religious minority people groups in regions that border it or were at one time part of it, but it sees as part of it.
Sure. Oh, sure. Well, you go to the Uyghurs, you probably would argue all of those Maoist communist principles. If you're the administrator of that state, I bet you're using your patriotism all over the place. It's when you come home to your very wealthy family who's driving Cadillacs in Shanghai that you're like, economics though, son, we gotta real politic this, and all of a sudden the principles of communism are kind of to the wayside because you want the latest apps for your kids. But when it comes to the minority peoples over here, that's all principle. That's pure principle. We're trying to spread communism, and this is bigger than you and your ethno-religious things, and we got to send you to re-education camps.
There's a little hypocrisy going on with we want to have Shenzhen have its factories make money, but
Right.
We've got this one-child policy. We got to make sure they're
following. You wag the fingers
following.
of patriotism and your mythos when it's most convenient, and you pretty much see that everywhere. I mean, you see it in the Islamic State. You see it, governmental hypocrisy and nationalism itself is myth-making.
It's a universal trait.
It's a universal trait of nationalism is myth-making. You have to describe a difference between Belgium and France. Otherwise, why are they different countries? Like, what is the difference between the United States and Canada? Oh, well, we're free and they're a socialist nightmare hellscape where you can't get health care unless you stand in line. Like, that's probably not true. But if it wasn't true and we were basically the same peoples and the same culture and society, how do we justify these independent, redundant militaries, all this stuff? You have to justify it. You have to myth make.
Unless you don't.
Unless you don't. I mean,
And then you don't have to.
you
justify
know,
it,
and that's
then
where
you
ideology comes in, right?
Yeah.
So
So that's what I mean. It's one of those okay, I look as someone who considers myself a lefty. A hard time putting labels on things. I don't know that I would say communist or, anarchist and
you can let other people label you. You just say what you believe,
Yeah.
and then let other people label.
so. But I wonder, under this broad socialist umbrella, if we include all of those labels, anarcho-syndicalist, communist, anarcho-communist, as varying kinds of socialism, or even you could even look at it as Marx and Engels described it as, communism or anarchism as the end goal of socialism, or the end point, right? That socialism will naturally end up in communism, and that capitalism will naturally end up in socialism. are there any countries that you can think of that are trying to do the socialism thing in one form or another that are seeing moderate success or any success in the modern era? Say a la Catalonia.
Right. Well, you know, in the news very recently, you have the northern Kurds in Syria. They pronounce it the Rojava in northern Syria. You have 3 cannons that were largely independent and, you know, much missed in the news media, oddly enough, are you know, they like to focus on these female fighters, right? That's the big story. The PKK, they have these in the middle of the Middle East, you know, fighting ISIS fighters are these ladies doing a bang up job.
It's all about identity politics. They just can't let it go.
Which is great, you know. I mean, this is a thing, but much more important in this area are these like libertarian, socialist, commune, anti-hierarchical. Like every level of government in these 3 canons in the Rojava have a female equivalent to the lawmaker. So every mayor has a female mayor, and they're working on doing the same for other ethno-religious people within. Because by the way, it's not all Kurds. There's Turkmen, there's Yazidi, there's tons of people here, and they worked out this thing because Assad, when this civil war started. This is a largely undeveloped region on purpose. They didn't want to develop oil wells there because they didn't want to give these people any means. So when the war breaks out and they're already kind of independent and armed, he didn't really want to mess with them. So he didn't mess with them. So they stayed kind of autonomous. And in their autonomy, where everyone's fighting away from them, they create this really interesting utopian thing that I haven't seen or heard of anywhere. And it's not just a Kurdish thing, and the Iraqi Kurds right next door have a way more traditional boss man, you know, mentality. The Iraqi Kurds are rather notoriously, what is the word, patronage, but with families. What is the
patriarchal?
Well, no, you're giving to your family members.
Is
that just patronage?
Is it just patronage?
Maybe
No. Matronage.
But next door in Syria, you had this, the Petri dish erupted with this experiment, you know, and then out of nowhere, it's largely being strangled in its crib, and it's really the untold story of this whole American pullout. And it's very tragic. It's very sad. So I see it there. This is the place, and you know, and I don't know that it happens without, you know, as Marx and Engels would say, it's going to bloom and blossom, because what I see is the powers that be, regardless of what country you're in, regardless of what system you have, the people that have, you know, the haves versus the have-nots, and they're playing a very effective game of whack-a-mole throughout the world, throughout the centuries. And this is a latest example of that.
You're saying the haves are effectively able to just prevent all uprisings, you know, with the power they have.
It's not even an uprising. Just leave them alone. They're doing it by themselves, harming no one.
So you mentioned Catalonia. I think
well, I had mentioned Catalonia to you prior, or did you mention it to me just now?
Just now, so, I mentioned it just now. We talked a little bit about this when we were talking about the various topics we wanted to talk about.
Rojava was an homage to Catalonia.
Right.
Get my drift.
Because, I mean, really not all that different, right? Catalonia existed as a state for just a few years before Franco came and took it all over again. But those type of uprisings, and there's another one I was thinking of that was in South America that was also relatively short-lived. But there have been others that have been longer-lived. Part of that, people argue, is that socialism, or that those types of socialism have a very hard time coexisting with capitalist systems. Capitalist systems will seek to pressure, snuff them out, because capitalism is all about aggregating that power, and it just cannot abide some portion of that power wanting to be egalitarian.
Sure, right, and that's the Cold War bipolar paradigm. It's these two systems can't exist with each other.
Oh, I remember what I wanted to ask. How similar is it to, when was this? 1871, 1880 and 1871, the Paris Commune.
Oh, the Paris Commune. I'd have to bone up on this.
Yeah,
What's
it's an
Paris Commune?
esoteric one, but it's one that
Sounds very familiar.
I feel like it got referenced quite a lot by Marx and Engels.
Mm-hmm.
Like they wrote that happened toward the end of their lives,
Mm-hmm.
right? And had a lot of their works had a lot of influence on it. And it was short-lived. That's a common theme, unfortunately, among a lot of these smaller groups that are trying for some kind of, anarcho-communistic, socialistic formulation of government. And so I wonder what.
Well, the myth of capitalism, right, is that you have resources that you can exploit, right? You have an ever-expanding that way to go. You have frontierism, laissez-faire or economic capitalism is like, oh, you could continued awesome upgrowth is always possible. And, now that we're at a global level, we realize that we're not on a flat earth going out towards an ever-expanding pastures that we can exploit if we just
We're
learn
not
how to
riding
do
on the
it.
back of a turtle?
We're instead on a spaceship floating through, a lot of nothing out there. So the socialist model, I think, is going to come back into play more because it's just not true that we have everything that we can continually exploit and do with this model over here, because that is what capitalism is. And it's
Right.
not a slam on, to me, I don't think that it's saying that we'll never have creativity again and that we'll never have these, you'll never get a better Twix bar because no one will try to compete with you. Like, competition will still exist. I don't see any problem with having a, especially when it comes to intellectual properties and stuff like that, of having a robust competition amongst things that are interesting for people to buy and consume and eat or things like that. It's just that when you have a capitalist system involved in healthcare, oil, air, water, those things are not the things that we have forever. So those are the spaceship parts on our Federation starship Earth that are off the table for the capitalists to exploit. But go ahead and make,
There's a-
X-Men versus Marvel movies all you want.
Yeah.
Like, go.
Well, so there are a couple of things I want to point out there, and we're not really having a is communism a good thing argument right now. We're really more concentrated on systems of government, I guess. But I mean, that's where the conversation went. Yeah, there's so much to unpack there.
So, when it comes to systems of government, are these systems of government representing what people want and are trying to do? Like, do the Chinese people want communism? Do Americans want freedom? Is that our thing? And is our government representing us and doing that?
Well,
Is
and
the
what does
Chinese
freedom mean?
government-
If freedom is just freedom to buy what the things you want to buy, then I mean, I could take it or leave it.
Right. But is the myth matching up to is the rhetoric matching up to the policies? Are the policies helping the people? Are they really that different from each other? Because frankly, it seems like the American citizenry and the Chinese citizenry want very similar things.
Right.
So
I mean,
why are
people
we
want very similar
adversarial?
things.
Why are we at odds with each other?
Right. I think a lot of it is ideological, and
But is it though?
maybe not. The part of it that isn't is the very specifically American libertarianism, the philosophical American libertarianism, meaning there is a strain of thought that says, basically all for me and nothing for anyone else. If you can get it and you can deprive it from others, that is your end goal, is amassing the most. And
is your right.
Yeah. And it's everyone's trying to do it, and so it's just totally fair because everyone's trying to do it that's the thing, right? And that type of
and it's cynical. It says that everyone's trying to do it.
right.
Right.
It's very Ayn Randian.
It doesn't believe that you're not trying to do it, right? Because if it does believe that, right, then it falls apart.
But what you're talking about is moving things like the air and the water and the oil into an economic category that a libertarian would not allow, that an American capitalist could not allow. How can you not allow me to try and treat something that is finite as though it's infinite and treat something that is infinite as though it's finite and charge you for it and make money off of it. How are you going to deprive me that right? And what socialists and communists are saying is, look, we want to take this air and this water and this oil and we want to move it into this very privatized form of economics and make it categorized as a sort of a public, non-fungible good, right? It's a public good that nobody should be able to just capture and start selling to people. Nestle shouldn't be allowed to just suck up the water out of the ground and sell it back to us.
Sense. I mean, I think, most peoples around the globe, regardless of their ideology, will agree with that. I mean, we are on spaceship Earth. We got to share the corn. That's a pretty common sense thing. You have to really intellectually bend over backwards. You have to say that global warming doesn't exist, that it's a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. You have to say that nope, everyone is just as libertarian as mean-spirited, and doesn't really believe in altruism, just like me. You have to convince yourself that government only exists to protect my property and has no other role. You really have to convince yourself of that. You have to have a major corporate media constantly feeding into that. You have to have militaries all over the world reinforcing and bringing the goods back home to do that. You have
Seems like you're describing the ingredients here in America right now.
Things to convince people that we're not on a spaceship and that we don't need to reserve these things. We do. It's common sense, and anyone that really thinks about it very long, I think, comes to that those conclusions.
Is there any country in the world today that you think is so apart from the Kurdish people that are very short-lived, very closer to Catalonia, but anyone that is either using the moniker communist or socialist that is doing the closest to living up to that,
to the Leninist stuff,
or at least a general ideal, right? If I was to basically put communism, anarchism, and socialism into a basic general ideal that everyone can agree on, the very basic fundamentals is worker ownership of the means of production via some means. What country or municipality do you think is at least attempting to get as close to that as a standard?
Or municipality within?
Sure.
I think you'd be pretty hard pressed. The example of the Rojava, most means of production, if you are actually able to build tanks, planes, trains, and automobiles, then you're co-opted. If you actually successfully do that, then the economic incentive to be less socialistic just breaks the dam.
In America, but you're just saying basically everywhere.
As soon as China came out of the
And this is
Maoist
the
agrarian
economic zones.
reforms, and the first next step after that is let's do economic reform. Let's wipe our hands of all of that stuff. And the minute we can, we're not in an emergency state anymore. We're not fighting the Japanese and all sides. We can put down the revolution and start eating cheeseburgers. We're going to do that right away. That they chose it in 1979. Mao wasn't even cold.
Yeah, wow.
And Deng Xiaoping betrayed his own values very publicly. I mean, that's not really a disputed thing. This is Wikipedia stuff. I mean, it's they introduced those judicial reforms and all that stuff to the wider market. I mean, they wanted the seat on the United Nations. So the seat of the UN was Taipei's until 1970, deep into the 70s. And, they wanted that international recognition because that's your next step. You don't live in a bubble. None of these countries live in a bubble, like you said.
Unless Earth is the bubble.
Unless Earth's a bubble. And that's why, you might disapprove of globalist rhetoric, but, to me, that's the
obvious
problem,
reality on the ground.
The problem with
on the Earth, in the sphere.
The problem with the globalists is that the ruling elite in all these countries is who is in charge no matter what. They take off the uniform depending on what score the team has. You know what I mean? It's
I don't think anyone's really a globalist. So I remember when I was a kid, there was the term globalization, and that was just a description of a naturally occurring thing. Guess what? Telecommunications and shipping are all getting better, and that means that internationalization and business is getting easier.
Globalist is a pejorative by the Alex Jones right wing, in that if you advocate for things that don't that dismantle borders, then you are a globalist. And here, the problem with the Venn diagram of truth is that there is some truth to that, and that, yeah, people with money and elites have no problem with this stuff. They love multinational corporations that, oh, I can exploit resources in more than one country? Sure, I'll be a globalist. Like, oh, the United Nations can pave the way
profitable.
for my, like, great. Oh, now I have an international body that'll help me do this. Instead of having to go to wars and build up militaries, now I just have to successfully get a vote through diplomatically. That's a lot easier. So the problem isn't the United Nations and globalism. The problem is who we hire to go do that stuff, and the anti-democratic forces that make sure that the elites are in power regardless.
One thing I know China does that I see is, at the very least, a good attempt at this sort of like interfacing with a capitalist system, while at the same time trying to have that the workers own the means of production. There's a a planned economy kind of ideal. Is for any company that exists in China that I think has more than 5 members of the Chinese party as employees of the company, has to have some percentage, it's a specific percentage of the board of that company has to be members of the Chinese party, the Communist Party. And that's a way of basically very high level making sure that even though these businesses are operating in a capitalistic capacity, even though these businesses operate out of Shanghai and Shenzhen and Hong Kong and Macau, and are operating with foreign businesses and are having to play that game, at the very least, they're doing things like overhiring workers because the national imperative is we need to get employment up. It's not acting necessarily in the capitalistic best interests of the individual country.
I mean, could you imagine how handy it would be for us to have political representation on the board of Facebook, especially right now? I mean, we're trying to drag them before congressional hearings and wag our fingers at them, and all they have to say are things like, oh, I don't know that off the top of my head, or I don't have that in front of me right now. I'll see you next time on my tour. But if you have them on the board where it's like, oh,
I'll be happy to tell your uncle how to work his iPhone.
Yeah, right? I mean, I can totally see that as, but then you got to wonder, is the cart pulling the horse, right? How much is the Communist Party sitting on these boards? They're involved in all these companies, and how much is the influence going both ways? I don't know. Maybe it'll be a real appendix-like, and they'll just shed the appendices of communism altogether at a certain point. But right now, I think it's very helpful in the mythos of the Communist Party and the government of Chinese to have these aspirational ideals, because there's not a country on earth whose government says, oh, we just rule people. That's all we do. Every government on earth has a mythos, has a story, has a reason why it exists and why the borders are what they are. Sometimes these borders are very hard fought over centuries of war. Sometimes they're invented with the Sykes-Picot line by British and French people thousands of miles away, and they're completely unjust and never work. Sometimes these borders are oceans. But these mythos are really important, and they're useful for governments. And I think that communism is a useful thing. It's an aspirational thing. Like, we want to, apparently their rhetoric is, we want to aspire to communism. We may not do it that much anymore. We have a few people on the boards of directors that are trying to make sure things, but we aspire to it. Just like,
that it's a project.
It's a socialist project.
It's
a socialist project. In the meantime, I don't know if this ties it in well, but I was speaking with my brother-in-law about school choice in public schools and a death spiral of public education, and how he's like, well, I'm into free school choice. And I'm like, well, that's a death spiral for education. He's a principal, he's a teacher, that's why we're talking about this. And I'm like, well, and he acknowledges all the problems, the death spiral of choice. And at the end of the day, he's like, yeah, but my kids are kids now. And thinking about, if my kids, in 10 years, maybe the schools will be better, but my kids will be adults by then. And that, I think, is the true tension of ideology, is that we are temporary things, and ideology is bigger than that. and more long-term than that. And it's really, really, really easy to get people to focus on themselves and the temporary, and it's a little harder to sacrifice for a future that is uncertain. And yeah, that was.
I totally feel you, man. Like long-term planning, I just wish that more organizations and governments would do some long-term planning instead of like quarterly planning. You have so many note cards, and I feel like you didn't flip through them. Is there anything that you have any burning tidbits that you wanted to add in?
You know, I was looking at some stuff for Hong Kong here. Are you familiar with the Hong Kong legislative, like the legislature of Hong Kong? You know,
Not how it's all that drastically different from China.
They have a very interesting assembly. You have 35, 70-member assembly. You have 35 directly elected, and then 35 seats that are basically like trade union type things, like 2 commercial, 2 industrial, it's a very fascinating thing, and it's not like they do in mainland China. It's a very unique and different system that lends itself. I think a big part of the problem why they have so much pro-Beijing politics in Hong Kong is that they have a lot of these business interests, and because Beijing is lining up with the capitalists more and more, it's making Hong Kong less distinct as they used to be. And so I think the pro-democracy forces in Hong Kong are having a real hard time gaining traction because we're bringing you jobs, right? Jobs,
Yeah.
jobs.
And that's a kind of a union. It's a union style of organizing. Sounds like.
Suppose so, but it's like codified into their legislature.
Right.
It's strange. It's a strange thing that I haven't seen elsewhere.
And this is, I think, okay, moral of the story is government systems are different across the board, have societal origins that don't often make tons of sense across.
They're organs you live with, and you know, it's slow to change, but they're very much like bodily organs.
Have you, are you familiar with CM Punk?
Yeah.
So this is a super chat from Mr. Orochi is asking if we're familiar with CM Punk. I'm not.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Kid's staring at me like I just told him I have a weasel in my pants.
I mean, I'm saying like someone
No,
cool is talking about a band that I've heard my niece listen to. Like, oh yeah, I've heard of CM Punk. Yeah. Is it Henry Rollins or something?
I don't know.
Wait, are you being serious?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We're gonna have to. We'll get educated.
We're gonna get
Thank you,
lectured
Mr.
for a
Orochi. We'll figure out who CM Punk is. We've greatly disappointed Kit over there. All right. We need to do this again. We need to do more of these.
If you want.
Really?
Yeah. Yes. We should need to do.
I
Go, just go.
All right. Come.
No, wait.
All right.
Punk is
Wait.
come on.
All right,
Okay.
He's gonna do it. Okay.
So right now we're off the camera. Hold on. Here we are. Yeah, I'm familiar who CM Punk is. I'm familiar with WWE, ECW, WCW. CM Punk is, I believe he's no longer with the WWE, but he is from the city of Chicago, gentlemen. Hello, quit looking at your smartphones. He's from the city of Chicago. He's one of us.
I know everyone in Chicago.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm very disappointed. Very disappointed in you, Paul DePont.
Sorry, I will have to learn.
I mean, come on,
I
man.
think he's saying it's wrestling.
Yeah, he's a wrestler.
Oh, I thought it was like a band.
No! What's wrong with you?
So that's where they're like fighting in a ring.
Oh, we were talking about communism. I don't know what this wrestler is. Anyway,
I think that's a good note.
Yeah.
that is a note, and it's the one we'll end it on.
Yeah. I'm disappointed in everyone on the team today.
Kit's disappointed.
I can't. I still have not been told why you're disappointed.
Because
He's from Chicago.
He's
He's
from
one of
Chicago.
us.
He's just from Chicago.
No,
There's
but he's
millions
also a
of
famous
people from-
wrestler. He's done a lot of good work, too.
I
He's
have
done a lot
done
of...
so little wrestling. You'd be very surprised at how little wrestling I've actually done.
all right,
Are we still on?
we are still
Very
on.
much.
We're very much still on.
There's still 135 people that watch that.
This is Chris Hewitt, a friend of mine and someone with a degree in political science, and always patient with me as I poke and prod and be like, "But communism, huh? How about communism?"
Yeah, it's great. Sure.
Thanks to everyone for joining us. Tune in tomorrow. We'll be on at our regular time, 6 p.m. Hopefully we'll get Chris back. Give us all the ones in the chat if you want to have Chris back on the show. All right. Peace,
God.
everyone.